All right. Now we welcome in a man who is a former member of the Black Dahlia Murder, also did some production with Black Dahlia Murder and many other bands, and currently is A&R at some label called Metal Blade Records. Mr. Ryan Williams, how are you, sir?
Hey, Brian, doing very well. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, of course.
Gotta get some new blood in here every once in a while. So
I
welcome
love it.
to the
Well, Jay
podcast.
Rustin's big shoes to fill, but I will do my
Jay
best.
Rustin and Mark Lewis and Bill Matoyer and
Yeah, exactly.
Butch Vig, uh, Dave's, so many of them. But anyway, uh, we're going to talk to you today about the great Ministry song, Just One Fix. Well, this is a really interesting one because on the production end of things, we're talking about the 1990s and what Ministry brought in here with this song is really they kind of helped usher in a whole new scene with this industrial metal stuff. And this is one of the first, metal-ish sounding um, records, I guess, that has not real drums on it, which is
Right.
it's kind of a big step for metal and for people in the metal world. But it was such a different thing, and the song was so heavy, it worked actually.
Totally. I mean, I feel like they were basically inventing a whole genre at this point in time. And there wasn't like 20 years of some stuff to go back to and look at and copy. They were on the fly making things happen. So really cool time and really cool scene, even though I think Al ended up hating the term industrial. They definitely made something happen here.
All artists hate terms that
Of
the
course.
press and everybody else comes around with. So
Yep,
I get that, but that's just part of the game. But this
totally.
was really interesting again because, and this is the early editions of Pro Tools was very wasn't really widely used, and different drum sounds and all that sort of stuff were really not used at this point. For them to do that. On this record, and specifically the song was kind of a groundbreaking in its own way, I think.
Totally. I mean, this was recorded in 91 or 92 in that era. And I don't think Pro Tools was even out until a few years after this. So they were creating all these drum samples, laying all the different samples in the song, doing all the effects, without the help of digital tools. Where now, I would be able to do this stuff pretty easily. But back then, it was an entirely different process. Cutting tape, just really a lot more difficult. So it really lends itself to their creativity at the time because it was a lot of work back then to make all this stuff happen.
Yeah, big time, big time. People think, oh, it's easy just to have, a drum machine or whatever, a compressor or whatever they were using to
No.
create the sounds, but not back then because it's just as difficult as if you're recording a live drum set because you still have to go through the same things and the same edits. And like you said, cutting tape, which if you don't know what cutting tape is, we've talked about it a lot on this show because we've talked about a lot of records that were made on tape. But, back in the day, pre Pro Tools, instead of just editing things together, you would actually have to cut the 2-inch tape that you're recording on to piece it all together. Of course, the most famous version of that would be the Metallica Black album, where they had I can't remember if they talked about it in some of the documentaries or not, but they had, I think, 5 or 6 people in the studio whose job was just to cut tape, especially with the drums. They're cutting all these drum parts together, and it was pretty crazy. I remember being in the studio, like, what are all these guys doing? They're all there just to cut tape. I was like, wow, that's pretty insane.
Totally. I read some interviews with Al too, and he said that he was actually doing that. And they were on substances at the time, let's just say, and he was up doing that stuff all himself. So I think it's a lost art now too. I don't think you'd meet a lot of engineers from the current era who'd even know how to do it, myself included. So
I mean,
yeah,
there's no need to now with Pro
right.
Tools. Pro Tools does the same thing, but it's all computerized.
Exactly.
The other thing too is, I mean, there's not when you look at this record as a whole, not this song in particular, but the whole record, with the drum sounds and the drum beats, because they were different than regular metal bands were. And this was, you can kind of go back and say this might even be an early origin of blast beats.
I was going to comment on the drum pattern on this too, because it's very non-traditional when you look at it from like a metal or rock standpoint. It's got the snares on 1, 2, 3, 4, which is just not really done in rock music. And then there's a kick on 3 and 4 and. So it gives it that industrial vibe, but it also you can tell that they built these samples and they made these samples and they processed them all together, and it's layered. There's probably, I don't know, the snare is probably 3 or 4 different drums blended together. And you can really tell they put a lot of work into that. And actually, a funny side note that Mike Faley actually told me is that Screw, the band Screw, was recording at Trax in Chicago, where they also recorded this album.
Yep.
And Screw, they would go over to the other studio and hang out with Al and see what was going on. And they ended up liking the drum sounds that they created over there so much that they ended up using them on the Screw album. So I just thought that was a really kind of interesting side note there.
Well, there's even more to that story.
Sure.
So, I mean, I knew Al because they used to record a lot at in Tornillo, Texas, which is where Cannibal Corpse recorded, this really crazy recording studio on this pecan farm. This pecan farmer had, is, 30 minutes outside of El Paso. So I got to know Al pretty well down there, and he was not as into the substances then as he was before. So he was a little bit more lucid. But I remember he ended up actually kind of producing that Screw record, or one of the Screw records. And he just kind of said, hey, I'm going to help these guys out. I'm going to do this. We're like, oh, cool. So, he does it. I said, what can we pay you? What do we owe you? He said, just send me a case of Jack Daniels and we'll call it even.
Wow. Yeah. And
all right, that's a good deal.
Amazing deal. And I think Al kind of just taught himself too, kind of engineering, producing. He would kind of like steal things from other engineers' settings, and you know what I mean? In that time, there was no YouTube. There was no way to learn this stuff other than just kind of hanging out with engineers, trying things yourself. So yeah, I give him a lot of credit for sculpting this sonically the way that it is, for sure.
Yeah, and in Tornillo, they actually built a whole nother room down there just for Al, because he loved it down there. I think he was living down there for a while and just making music in the studio. And they built this whole studio just for him and around him and what he wanted. It was really kind of interesting.
It's cool.
I think they were pretty much finished with it when we were down there. But I was talking to the guy that owned the studio and Al about the whole process, and it was pretty interesting. It was a lot different than the regular studio. The regular studio had the big, gigantic, SSL board and the whole thing, and Al's was a little bit different because the kind of music they were making was different. So it had more of those processors and these other things. You can look, there's an article somewhere that I looked up when I was doing research on this, and Al kind of talks about how they programmed the drums and did all these things on the, I guess now they would be primitive
right
rendition of those drum machines.
Drum machines.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so impressive that when you look back on it now and you listen to the record now, I mean, it still sounds really great, still sounds really fresh. But how many bands really kind of took stuff from there? Like, to me, like I said before, like a lot of the blast beat stuff, you can trace it back to this early Ministry stuff. You can kind of hear what they were trying to do. Not as fast, obviously, but there was some fast stuff. But just the way it sounded.
Totally. And the other thing too, just on the sonics in general that I noticed. Well, first of all, I mean, the guitar tone I think is just phenomenal on this.
Yep.
And holds up to this day. I mean, if I got this guitar tone turned in on a band from today, I would be stoked. It's still amazing. I couldn't find the exact details on everything they used. I think it was probably, a Marshall, maybe modified, probably vintage 30s with a boost, which is just kind of like a classic setup, and it just holds the test of time. It just still sounds great. Overall, I felt like the mix, it doesn't have a ton of low end. It's kind of more weighted towards the mids and the highs, which is kind of cool because as you kind of crank it up, it just kind of sounds better the louder you play it, which is really interesting. And it's I guess it was kind of indicative of the times, that kind of mixing style, but it's cool. It's different. It's really in your face, and it still sounds great to this day.
100%. And it's interesting because, again, you look at the time, and of course this was, when metal was basically being wiped off the map with grunge music as it needed to be at that point. So you had the grunge stuff would have their own vibe and their own sound, still being really heavy. And then this whole wave of industrial bands coming in, certainly led by Ministry, that were super heavy, but also had all the other industrial elements in there. And I know we're going to talk to Monty Pittman next, who's in Ministry these days. Cool. And a lot of, because I mentioned to him, like, hey, what was it that, and I remember talking to Al about it too in the studio, but I can't remember what his exact reason for it was, but I mean, why did you get so heavy? And basically, Monty summed it up. I'm like Mike, who was in Rigor Mortis, came in,
Yes.
and he's a great guitar player with great riffs, and I think that's where a lot of that stuff came up. And Al's like, hey, this stuff sounds really good with what we're doing.
There's actually a Revolver interview where Al credits Mike with writing this main riff. So I don't know if he's not listed technically as one of the writers, but that would make sense to me given his kind of thrash background. So I'd be really interested to know because this is one of the best riffs of all time. In my parlance, I call it a main stage riff. It's one of those riffs that sounds good to 30 people or 30,000 people at a huge outdoor fest or something. Just the whole song is a masterclass to me in being simple but effective. And it's like, it really goes to show you that you really only do need one riff can be an entire song, and it doesn't get boring. It really holds your attention the whole time. And there's really only like a few guitar parts. There's not, when you really start to break it down, there's not a lot of stuff going on. It's just the production tricks, the sampling. It's also like a kind of a master class in how to incorporate samples in a really cool way. And I don't know which version you've heard the most, but the video version is actually different than the album version.
Yes.
And there's the William Burroughs samples on the video version that there's a whole backstory to how they got those. And there was like clearance issues. They ended up going directly to him. And there's, again, on Revolver, you can read all about that. And it's a very interesting story. But I kind of prefer the album version, and those the samples at the very beginning. Give me the Thorazine Man from the movie The Trip, which with Peter Fonda and Bruce Dern.
Yep.
And then there's the No from Hellraiser 2. Then there's just some weird like screaming and like creepy stuff that's kind of sprinkled in throughout the whole song. I couldn't find a definitive answer on what that sample is. There's rumors that it was sampled from Nine Inch Nails, but I don't think that's correct based on when that Nine Inch Nails EP came out and when this came out. And then there's Never Trust a Junkie from Sid and Nancy. And that's just the first 30 seconds of the song. There's already 4 samples.
Exactly.
That really are cool and play into the whole thing.
100%. And that's, that was kind of the genius of it back then, because you could use the samples until people kind of figured out, hey,
yes,
we need to get paid, which is why the video version is different, because they couldn't get clearance on all these movies and stuff. And that was, so many artists in the early 90s, including one of our artists, Guar, which used a bunch of samples, which got them and us into trouble on a couple of occasions. But yeah, you could kind of get away with that early on, and that's what so many of those industrial bands did. By the way, I think when we're talking about the riff, which is it's a complete heavy metal riff, so I wouldn't be surprised at all if Mike had something to do with it. But you never know.
Yes,
but they should have called the song just One Riff.
That's true.
Would have been a better title. But but it's interesting. Martin Popoff, at the beginning was kind of talking about the production of the song. It's very 90s, like, the guitars are out front, the vocals are kind of in the back, and he's kind of mumbling a lot with that kind of that industrial style vocal, whatever effects they have on it. But that's why it really is the riff that surrounds the music and the whole song. And you're right, because I never really thought about it. I just listen to music. I don't think about different parts and different rips and stuff that much, because I don't play the music. I just listen to it. But you're right, and Monty mentioned the same thing, which you'll hear shortly, that that riff is pretty much the whole song, but it's so good. Like it still could be 10 minutes long, and I still wouldn't get bored of that riff.
I mean, I listened to the song probably 30 times getting ready for this, and I'm still not bored of it by the end. So that really, I think, just shows you that a great riff, just you almost can't get sick of it if it's great.
Yeah, it's so good. And it was kind of the wild west in terms of heavy music back then, because you had this whole, again, like I mentioned, the whole grunge scene, and then this whole scene starts coming in, and there's all these different subgenres of metal that were coming in. Certainly death metal was obviously beginning in the 90s, and it was reshaping really, what metal could and would be. And I love that, because you just can't stay the same. You've got to evolve, and it's got to be different. And I love these new elements coming in with this stuff and all the other things we talked about, because it really does add extra elements to it, where you go like, oh, wow, heavy music can be industrialized or any, you know, in any other way. And certainly Ministry did a great job. And I mean, you know, those three records together were just, you know, massively huge. Like Martin said, this was the platinum record in the US. I think it was platinum in Canada and Australia. And it was a big record for them.
Yeah, and the label put out, I guess, a lot of money to record it too, and then they actually ended up doubling down, and I guess that after the label heard the first song, they were like, "What is this? We don't know what this is," and you know, of course, it ended up being a huge hit, and it all worked out. So it's interesting, man. It really is.
Yeah, absolutely legendary stuff. Well, dude, you did great. You were phenomenal. So thanks for doing this, and we will talk to you again on this podcast. So
I would love that anytime. Just please, yeah, let me know. I'd be glad to.
awesome. Thanks again, man. And yeah, we'll see you soon, I guess.
All right, sounds good.
You can't leave though because we have to upload.